Welcome back to session 3 of our study of Galatians. I hope by now when I say, what is Galatians, you're starting to form a pretty consistent answer to that question. And the answer that I would like for you to think about during the duration of our time, although you can improve upon it and fix it later, is that Galatians is a defense of gospel freedom. Paul has preached the gospel to these people, they have believed it, and then they were tempted to believe a different gospel that told them the teachers would say, a better path forward. And Paul basically says to them, you do not need a better path forward. You are on the best path available. Just keep on walking. And so we are unpacking Paul's argument in defending the gospel that he preaches, a gospel that gives us freedom to follow Jesus in the Spirit, apart from the law. We saw up top that Paul is in fighting mode and that he really is calling them back to the one true gospel. Then we looked at the last session at the beginning of Paul's biographical defense, and we saw that Paul draws specific attention to the fact that just like the prophetic messages in the Old Testament, you should believe this because it is the revelation of God. It's not something a person came up with. He's going to continue in the next chapter. We're going to look at chapter 2 of Galatians, verses 1 through 10. I want to read the text to you. I want to talk about some of the issues that we're just going to mention and then kind of keep in mind but set aside so that we can focus our attention on what Paul is talking about and what he's saying as he does so. It says, Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure that I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message. Hear that phrase. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. Okay, there's a couple of things that I want to mention because this text has a lot of details and some of them are fairly confusing. I also want to acknowledge, just because I want to be responsible to you, even though I'm not trying to do like intense scholarship, I'm just trying to guide you in a Bible study. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of things that scholars debate when it comes to this particular text. Honestly, most of the details are debated. And one of the big questions is, what event is Paul talking about when he describes going to Jerusalem? Is this something that happens in the book of Acts? Is it something that doesn't happen in the book of Acts? Does this mean that the book of Acts can't be trusted? If it can, how do you fit them all together? And I'm not necessarily real interested in getting into some of those details in this particular setting, but I do want you to be aware of them. And I want to go ahead and tell you my opinion on it is that Paul is actually describing something that happened in Acts chapter 11. So Paul in the book of Acts is called and converted to the Lord in Acts chapter 9. This is when he meets the Lord on the road to Damascus. And then he immediately starts doing some ministry there in the last half of 9 and tries to go down to Jerusalem. People are not too keen on him. And so Barnabas puts his arm around him and says, you can trust this guy. Then he goes off and does some ministry. And then I think we're talking here about the visit of Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem in Acts 11. So you, if you're interested in this, should go read Acts 11. I think it matches what is actually taking place. So in Acts 11, Paul and Barnabas are doing ministry to Jews and to Gentiles. And there's a prophet who comes named Agabus, and he predicts a famine throughout the world. And as a result of this famine, Paul and Barnabas, together with some of the other Gentile Christians in that area, gather some funds, some resources to take back to the church in Jerusalem. And they donate these financial resources, material resources, to the church in Jerusalem to take care of these people, their brothers and sisters in the Lord, Jewish Christians, other Jewish Christians. Paul, of course, is Jewish. Take these things to them so that they can be cared for during the famine. And apparently while he's there, they have some conversations with different leaders. I don't think that Paul is describing the later meeting in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. I think he's describing chapter 11. If you're sort of like Acts 15, Acts 11, I don't even know what's going on, it's okay, honestly. Just forget about it. Look into it later. You can watch this again later if you want to hear it again. I think that we're describing here an event that took place as reported by Luke in Acts chapter 11. A couple other things just by way of introduction before we get into the text. Another thing that complicates this story is the dating, and not like people going on dates, but Paul describing the amount of time between things. So he talks about after 3 years and then after 14 years. And it's confusing because it's not entirely clear, like after 14 years, do you mean like you got converted and then after 3 years and then after 14 years, so like 17 years later? Or do you mean like you got converted and then 3 years from that you went to Jerusalem, but then another 14 years from the initial event? So again, look into the details as much as you find them interesting, but please don't get lost in them. The last thing I want to say, and this is actually fairly important for understanding what's going on, is why is Paul making such a big deal about Jerusalem? You may know the answer, you may not, but simply put, Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish world. It was the city that God had decided to be the place where his temple would be built, where his presence would dwell among his people, and it was the city of the great King David. I mean, it really was the centerpiece of their faith. So it would be like if you took, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and L.A., and Miami, and like put them all in one city. This is the cultural center, this is the political center, and this is the religious center. So in that sense, Jerusalem was the center of their life, and it had a symbolic authority that Paul has to address. Because these teachers who are coming in and telling the Gentile Christians, you need to follow the law, are very likely claiming the authority of the church in Jerusalem and of James who leads it. And so Paul has to address that in some form or fashion. That's why he's talking so much about Jerusalem. Okay, let's actually look at what's going on in the text. We're going to do two questions. We're going to ask what actually happened, and then we're going to ask, what do we do with this? Well, what actually happened as Paul reported it is that he, after a time, decided to go down to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus. They were responding to a revelation, which again, I think is the prophet Agabus saying, famine is coming, you need to take care of these people. And they had a small-scale meeting with some of the leaders. It wasn't a big gathering. It was a small-scale, fairly private meeting with Peter, James, and John. Paul says he wanted to know that he wasn't running his race or hadn't run his race in vain. This is a tricky statement because clearly Paul says they added nothing to my message. So Paul is not asking them if it's okay for him to preach the gospel that he's preaching, but he does at the same time see something at stake. What does Paul see at stake? Unity. Paul doesn't want to think that his ministry is causing division among the people of God. And so the thing that he's worried about is, man, if I'm preaching this gospel to Gentiles that I know God has called me to preach, but they have a problem with it, then we're going to be working at odds with one another. So Paul does want their support, but he doesn't need their support. Hope that makes sense. So Paul says, I wanted to find out that I wasn't running my race in vain. And as a matter of fact, that is precisely what went down. He says, I took Titus with me, who was Greek, meaning not Jewish, and he wasn't compelled to be circumcised. Why is that a big deal? Well, because in their world, if you were a Gentile, meaning a non-Jewish person, who was going to become a member of the family of God by submitting yourself to the law of Moses, then the way in which you would signify your commitment to the law of Moses was to become circumcised. It was not exactly the same, but sort of like how baptism functions for us as the way in which a person demonstrates their faith in Jesus and receives membership in the family of God. And so he says, I took Titus along, not circumcised, and nobody had a problem with it. Nobody looked at him and said, you need to go have surgical operation. No, he was fine, and he was probably happy about that. So this is Paul's way of saying, I presented what I'm doing, they talked about what they're doing, and we came to perfectly fine agreement, okay? So Paul is laying this out for them in no uncertain terms. We went down there to take care of a need in response to a revelation and found out we were all on the same page. And he also says, we did this in part because there were some false brothers, that's strong language, trying to spy, trying to infiltrate our ranks to spy on our freedom. And we wanted to fight for freedom for your sake, the Galatians. And then after Paul's report of events, you have Paul's commentary. And we've kind of already covered the main thing that he's saying. He's clarifying that I don't need anyone's approval. They added nothing to my message, but I wanted to make sure we were on the same page, and we were. We're preaching the same message, the good news of God's grace manifest in Jesus, made available to us by faith. Peter was focusing his ministry on preaching to Jews. Paul was focusing his ministry on preaching to Gentiles. So different mission field, but same message that they're preaching, and they're definitely together on the content of the gospel, as well as the fact that they need to take care of each other, particularly the poor. Remember, this was part of the reason why Paul went down there, to take care of the poor in Jerusalem, so as to manifest the unity of God's people. Certainly not that we don't also take care of the world's poor, but here the emphasis is actually on we take care of each other. We remember the poor among us, which is certainly what Paul himself was interested in doing. So that's what actually happened when Paul made this trip. What do we do with this? I'd like to talk about some universal lessons that we draw from this, and then I also want to talk about how it fits into Paul's argument. So stepping away for a moment from our exposition of Galatians, let's talk about how this hits in our particular world. One of the things that we as Christians wrestle with today is, what holds us together as, one apostolic universal church. You've, of course, got different denominations. You've got different traditions. Generally speaking, you've got the Roman Catholic Church. You've got the Eastern Orthodox Church. You've got the Protestant Church. And within each of those, you have various sects, especially within the Protestant Church. You have a lot of the denominations. And so there's some question about, are we just divided and that's it? What holds us together? And it related to this question of what holds us together, who is our authority? Now, of course, different groups will say different things. The Catholic Church would say that the papacy, the Pope, is ultimately, the teaching magisterium of the church is the thing that holds us together and is the way in which God's authoritative word is made known. The Orthodox Church would say, no, it's not the Pope, but it is the councils of the early church and the tradition of the church as manifest in these key bishops, these key important leaders. And so similar, but a little bit different, you have to submit yourself to this institutional structure in order to be part of the faithful church. Among Protestants, you've got different denominations saying different things. Some would say it's this particular church model of leadership, or it's that particular church model of leadership. And I don't necessarily want to start fights, but I don't want to avoid hard truths. And what I see in this text is a very clear set of guardrails around authority in the church. What Paul seems to be saying in no uncertain terms is the thing that holds us together is the apostolic message. It is the gospel that we find in the New Testament. That doesn't mean that tradition doesn't matter, not even close. The tradition, the broad, great tradition of the church is incredibly important for our understanding of the gospel. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask hard questions about how to do church. We certainly should. We should think through the scriptures. We should think through our history. We should listen to one another. But I'm just telling you, for my money, what I see here is no place to say that I give any particular man or group of men authority over what I believe, except for the apostolic gospel itself. Think about this. Paul has said that Peter, whom the Catholic Church would regard as the first pope, added nothing to my message. I did not need his approval, although I was happy to have his support. And this is after Paul said in chapter 1, even if I come to you and preach a different gospel, then I am accursed. So Paul's very clear that the authority of the apostles is not something that rests in the apostles or in those that come after the apostles, but the message that the apostles preach. I hope you understand what I'm saying. And again, this is to step away from Galatians and ask how what Paul is saying applies to some of the specific questions that we wrestle with. Now, more immediately, I'd like to come back to Galatians and make sure that we're understanding the flow of Paul's particular argument. So once again, Galatians is a defense of gospel freedom. And the first two chapters are Paul's biographical defense of the gospel. The first leg of this defense that we looked at in our last session is that the gospel is received by revelation. It's not something we've figured out on our own. It's not something we received from other people. It was received by divine revelation. And here Paul adds to that the second thing. It is supported by Jerusalem, which here is symbolic for those leaders of the early church that Jesus had sent to initially start preaching the gospel and setting the tone for the church together. So we have the biographical defense of the gospel, and we have seen that it is received by revelation, and we have seen that it is, in addition to this, supported by Jerusalem. Next time, come back, and we're actually going to wrap up Paul's biographical defense in pretty dramatic fashion, actually, because it involves a fight between the two most important and biggest names in the early church, Peter and Paul. And we're going to look at the dispute that they had and the way in which Paul takes that as an opportunity to clarify some really important things for us. That's in our next session. For now, we acknowledge and celebrate the ground of our unity, a commitment to take care of one another, no question. But even more deeply than this, the one apostolic gospel that God has revealed by sending Jesus and then by Jesus sending the apostles to communicate to us divine truth. It is not the Pope, though we may appreciate him. It is not the councils, though they are incredibly important. It is not the creeds, though some of them I regard as, at some level, something we're not allowed to disagree with. It is not even the persons of the apostles themselves. It is the gospel. It is the good news that in Christ we are saved by grace through faith. So rejoice in that, be at peace, and be free.